This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by MOVA Globes. Sit back, watch them spin, and be amazed. When you think of early European settlers to the part of the New World that would become the United States, the Puritans certainly come to mind. They played a central role in establishing the colonies as a place of religious freedom. Their habits still impact our culture today, and several presidents are descended from them. But it might surprise many Americans to find out that the Pilgrims didn't come here directly from England on the Mayflower, but rather many of them first spent 12 years in a Dutch city that played a significant role in influencing and cementing their beliefs. The quaint university city of Leiden and its impact on U.S. history deserves to be remembered. The Pilgrims, although that term would not come to be applied to them until after their voyage to the New World, were a group of English Puritans whose beliefs were seen as too extreme by King James I of England. While there were several questions of doctrine involved, the fundamental issue was that the Puritans believed that the English Reformation had not gone far enough and sought to remove from the Anglican Church what they saw to be Roman Catholic practices. In fact, the term Puritan refers to a desire to purify the Church of England. While there was a range of views, some more radical Puritans sought to wholly separate themselves from the Church, and these were called Puritan separatists. In 1603, when after the death of Elizabeth I, the crown passed to James I, the Puritans hoped that James's Scottish Calvinist upbringing would bring more reform. However, James I's reforms did not go far enough for some, and those who disagreed faced various forms of persecution, although haphazardly enforced. Fearing this persecution, some more radical groups sought to leave England for a place to live where the members could freely practice their religion and live according to the rules that they had set for themselves. This was not an easy path, as it was illegal for them to immigrate. Several were imprisoned for failed attempts. Holland became a haven for the fleeing English separatist families. The Dutch were unusually tolerant, having themselves suffered religious persecution by Spain. The so-called Dutch Revolt was driven by a number of issues, both political and religious, but a central point was a Protestant revolt against the Catholic Church, and so the Dutch Republic had become a place for Protestants fleeing persecution elsewhere. The rebellion 7 Dutch provinces had declared their independence from Catholic Spanish Habsburg rule in 1581 in the Act van Verlatinghe, literally the Act of Departure, and more commonly called the Declaration of Independence. This document would have an influence on the fledgling United States nearly 2 centuries later. The Committee of Five was well aware of the existence of this document, and the American Declaration of Independence from 1776 borrowed passages, most notably the principle that citizens have the right to abandon their monarch if he does not respect the laws and traditional freedoms of the citizens. By 1608, the year the English Puritans managed to flee England, the war had largely turned into a stalemate, and in 1609 a 12-year truce was declared, although it was not a permanent peace, and Spain still did not recognize Dutch independence. While they first settled in Amsterdam, they quickly got caught up in rivalries with other Protestant factions, who had for similar reasons fled England. Moreover, living was difficult in the Dutch capital, where restrictive guild rules essentially limited immigrants to manual labor. After just 9 months, they decided to relocate to the city of Leiden. Leiden had a renowned cloth industry. Its prestigious university, the oldest in the Netherlands, had been established 34 years earlier in 1575, and was a present by William of Orange to the people of Leiden for the heroic resistance against Spanish occupation during the first years of the 80 Years Dutch War for Independence. In this period, Leiden was the second largest city of the Dutch Republic after Amsterdam. It had tripled in size in 50 years, going from 15,000 just prior to the Spanish siege of the city in 1574 to 45,000 inhabitants soon after the Pilgrims' departure in 622. Leiden's historical writer, Jerome Windmeyer, notes many believers and persecuted individuals found shelter in Leiden. These were, of course, refugees with a Protestant background, such as Walloon Protestants, separatists from England, and Huguenots from France. But other believers could also find refuge here, such as Catholics, Mennonites, Anabaptists, Lutherans, and Jews. About 1/3 of the Leiden population at this time consisted of refugees. This tolerance from the Leiden city government would certainly have appealed to the Pilgrim Fathers. Their move to Leiden was carefully orchestrated, and in a now famous letter, City Secretary Jan van Hout gave them permission to move to Leiden on 12 February 1609, saying that Leiden refuses no honest people free entry to come live in the city, as long as they behave honestly and obey all the laws and ordinances, and under those conditions the applicant's arrival here would be pleasing and welcome. At the time, people who migrated to Leiden didn't need permission to do so, so it's curious why the Pilgrims did. According to the Leiden American Pilgrim Museum, they did this to make sure that if something happened to them, their offspring could be taken care of by the city's orphanage and not sent back to where their parents came from, which was the usual practice for immigrant orphans. This suggested that in 1609, the Pilgrims were thinking about living in Leiden for an extended period of time. In Leiden, the Puritans faced the same issues all migrants do. They had to learn the language and find a trade to better integrate into the local community. According to the Leiden American Pilgrim Museum, the members of the Pilgrim congregation in Leiden worked in many different professions and trades. Leiden's trade guild regulations were less restrictive than those of Amsterdam, where most immigrants were excluded from all but occasional labor, such as unloading ships. In Leiden, a single guild member could hire helpers who were not members. For example, William Bradford, a member of the Fustian, or Serge Weavers Guild, which met in the former chapel of the St. Jacob's Hospital, which is now the Lode-Wijkskerk, could thus employ other pilgrims who were not guild members. About half the pilgrims worked in Leiden's cloth industry as weavers, and wool combers, carders, cloth fullers, etc. At this time, about half the town's general population worked in textile production, which was thriving because, since Dutch de facto independence from Spain, it was no longer burdened by heavy taxation put in place by the Spanish king to finance his wars. They found residence in the direct vicinity of the still-standing Church of St. Peter, built in 1121. The court, with almshouses around it, called a hofje, now standing on the place they lived, commemorates the Pilgrims and their leader, John Robinson. Their occupations are mentioned in various kinds of documents, especially betrothal records. The occupations known for members of Robinson's congregation included tailor, hat maker, glover, hosier, shoemaker, carpenter, block and tackle maker, twine maker, leather worker, cooper, cabinet maker, brewer's employee, mason, watchmaker, mirror maker, tobacco seller, tobacco pipe maker, midwife, and merchant. The occupation of housewife and mother is not specifically mentioned in the documents and must have been considered self-evident. The congregation of Robinson faced the challenges of staying true to their faith without alienating themselves from the society that they were now a part of. An English Puritan congregation had been established 2 years prior to their arrival, but it didn't have its own minister. Like the Walloon and German Protestant congregations, they were considered part of the Dutch Reformed Church. Their rites and beliefs were identical, only the language used in the service was different. In those years, the Dutch minister would preach in English whenever he held a sermon for the English congregation. However, when the minister of the Dutch Reformed Church realized that the faith of the newly arrived Puritans was incompatible with his teachings, the Pilgrims successfully petitioned to have their own minister by September 1609. The salary of Reverend Robert Dury was to be paid by the city government, as was customary. It's important to understand the local context in which the Pilgrims settled. With the conflict against the Catholic Spanish now in the background, a heated religious debate within the largely Calvinist Dutch Republic had arisen. The main apple of discord was the issue of predestination. The Counter-Remonstrants, also known as the Precisians or the Gomorrists, were a Calvinist group named for their opposition to the Remonstrants or the Arminians. The leader of the Counter-Remonstrants was the theologian Francis Gomorrus, based in Leiden. The core of the Counter-Remonstrants belief was predestination, which means that a person's life is predetermined. Everyone is born with a specific purpose, and individuals don't have free will to deviate from it, especially concerning their eternal salvation. According to the Counter-Remonstrants, a person's fate of reaching heaven or not was entirely predestined by God, and nothing a person did during their lifetime could change that predetermined outcome. In contrast, the Remonstrants, followers of theologian Jacobus Arminius, embraced a milder version of predestination. They believed that God predestined those for eternal salvation whom he knew in advance would become believers during their lifetime, allowing human influence on the possibility of attaining heaven. Reverend John Robinson, the Pilgrims' pastor, played a role in the theological debates on predestination and free will at the University of Leiden. These debates were an extension of a theological conflict involving professors Jacobus Arminius and Franciscus Gomorrus. The positions taken in these debates had immediate political implications and garnered significant international attention. At one point, King James I of England even got involved to express his dissatisfaction with a professorial appointment. Robinson was a friend of the counter-remonstrant professor Johannes Polyander. Robinson is known to have engaged in a successful debate against the remonstrant professor Simon Episcopus. Polyander, who wrote the introduction to one of Robinson's books published by William Brewster, likely played a role in securing permission for the Pilgrims to conduct their religious services in a room within the Behindhof Chapel. The chapel had been repurposed after the Reformation to house the university's anatomy theater, library, lecture rooms, and even a room for practicing fencing. But as no classes or fencing practice was held on Sunday, the university allowed Robinson's congregation to use the building for their religious practices. These discussions showed both the depth of dissent over doctrine, even among Protestants, but also the extent to which the Puritans were able to practice their religion freely while in Leiden. Among the things that they were exposed to in Leiden was possibly the precursor to the most American of traditions. Dutch Protestants, remonstrants and precisians alike, believed in the importance of thanking God for what he had provided them on a regular basis. Regardless of whether they believed God had decided their faith at birth or whether God's grace depended on one's actions throughout his life, the Dutch Protestants were united in a desire to thank God for a good harvest. A Christian holiday called Dankdag, literally Thank Day, but in English commonly Thanksgiving, was in Europe almost exclusively celebrated in the Netherlands. The full name is Thanksgiving Day for Crops and Labor, and it always falls on the first Wednesday of November. Various Reformed movements have a church service in the evening to thank God for everything he has given that year. The Dutch evangelical public broadcaster EO notes, there are similarities between Dankdag and American Thanksgiving. On both holidays, you reflect on what you've received and express your gratitude. It's likely that the Dutch Dankdag served as an early version of the American Thanksgiving. The Pilgrim Fathers carried their memories of Dankdag with them and adopted it to their new situation. However, there are also significant differences. Thanksgiving is a celebration for the entire American population, has become less religious in recent times, and is often celebrated at home. It's centered around food, particularly the traditional turkey, which frequently appears in American movies and on TV shows. In the Netherlands, only stricter Protestants observe Dankdag, primarily in an evening church service. It's unclear when exactly the Pilgrims first came into contact with the Dutch Thanksgiving. It might have been before their move to Leiden, when they lived in Amsterdam. Less likely is the first phase of their life in Leiden, when they were still part of the general Protestant congregation in Leiden, because this period doesn't match up with the autumn months in which Thanksgiving is celebrated. Another possibility, perhaps the most likely, is that their introduction to Thanksgiving wasn't one single event. As their time in Leiden progressed and their understanding of the Dutch and integration in local society improved, they might gradually have come to understand, appreciate, and incorporate Thanksgiving into their own religious practices. A different theory suggests that Thanksgiving is instead, or perhaps also, based on the Leiden local holiday of Drie Oktober, 3rd of October. On this day in 1574, the Spanish siege on the city of Leiden was broken by the Dutch rebels. The starving local population was given herring, white bread, and a Dutch dish called hoetspot, a dish consisting of boiled and mashed potatoes, carrots, and onions. This event is annually celebrated by the locals by eating the same dishes, as well as a fair and a parade. The city's secretary, Jan van Hout, who had given the Pilgrims permission to settle in the city, was already in office back in 1574 and would die only months after the first celebration that the Pilgrims witnessed in December 1609. Celebrations giving thanks, especially after harvest, are as old as civilization. In fact, there were earlier civilizations by settlers in the New World before that famous feast in 1621, and the Native American Wampanoag, who joined the feast, held their own seasonal celebrations before they ever encountered the Pilgrims. Still, there is little doubt that the tradition so important to Americans today and intimately tied to Pilgrim fact and legend was influenced by their time in Leiden. Despite their ability to practice their faith freely, in 1620 the congregation decided to leave Leiden. While Americans are generally familiar with the Mayflower, their journey actually started aboard a ship called the Speedwell, which carried them from Leiden to Southampton. Initially, Speedwell was to go to the New World along with the Mayflower, but the ship proved unseaworthy. It was a combination of factors that contributed to the Pilgrims' choice to leave Leiden and embark on a dangerous sea voyage to an unknown and, in their opinion, unsettled land. William Bradford, Pilgrim and intermittent governor of the Plymouth colony for 30 years between 1621 and 1657, mentioned several complaints in his journal of Plymouth Plantation. First, life in Holland was so hard that few from England would come to join them, unwilling to subject themselves to a life characterized by the great labor and hard fare with other convenience, which the Pilgrims underwent and were contented with. Second, old age began to steal upon them. Third, Bradford blamed the Dutch for the Pilgrims oppressing even their own children, and not merely their servants, with excessive work. These complaints might seem ironic, given the hardships the group faced in the New World, but even in Leiden it had proved difficult for the congregation to earn a living, and life had been hard. Bradford himself originally lived in an area called Stink Alley. Some members had returned to England as a result, and there was a fear the congregation would be broken up. Even worse, he said, was that some of the children revolted, drawn by the bad example of Dutch children into loose behavior and leaving home. After a decade in the Dutch Republic, they feared that their children were becoming more Dutch than English, and they feared that their congregation would slowly disappear. Another reason Bradford gave was that the Pilgrims wanted to try to convert the Indians. Having had little success convincing the Dutch on religious questions, such as observing the Sabbath, they thought that there was little their congregation to do to benefit the community in Leiden, and they had a desire for a more meaningful missionary work. Finally, there was the fear of war. A 12-year truce with the Spanish Habsburgs was coming to an end, and already the religious debate over predestination had started to turn violent, with the Leiden city government having to set up barricades and hire mercenaries, fearful of a popular uprising. In the spring of 1620, the Pilgrims gathered their belongings and made their way across the Channel. After uniting with another group of immigrants, a grand total of 102 boarded the Mayflower from Plymouth, England, on September 6, 1620, to the New World, where they'd acquired a land patent from the London Company. Still, the time that the so-called Pilgrim Fathers spent in Leiden had a profound impact on the history of what would become the United States. No less than 9 presidents are descendants from Pilgrims who lived in Leiden. Presidents John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, Calvin Coolidge, Zachary Taylor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, George H. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. John Adams was the United States minister to the Netherlands between 1782 and 1788 and lived in Leiden with his sons John Quincy and Charles. His mission was to gain support for the new American state. John preferred Leiden to Amsterdam, stating that the company and conversation are better in Leiden, and sent his sons to the oldest university in the country. They enrolled in January 1781. The admissions register from the time containing their names can still be found in the university library. John Quincy was only 13 at the time, not an unusual age to enroll in those days. And according to Jan Postma, former mayor of Leiden and writer of John Adams and his Leiden Friends, Quincy Adams learned to speak fluent Dutch during his 2-year stay in Leiden, making him the second U.S. president to speak Dutch after Martin Van Buren, who grew up in a community of Dutch immigrants in New York and only learned English after entering school. Van Buren is the only U.S. president to speak English as a second language. Yes, we Americans tend to romanticize these Pilgrim Fathers. For people who were supposedly fleeing religious intolerance when they got to the New World, they established in Plymouth Bay Colony a theocracy that went so far as to banish and even execute religious dissenters. And that likely influenced the decision to include in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution a prohibition against establishing a state religion. But it was also likely the religious intolerance that they witnessed in England and the religious tolerance that they witnessed in Leiden that also influenced the decision to include in that amendment a protection for the free expression of religion. President George H. Bush visited Leiden in July of 1989. He was a distant relative of Thomas Blossom, who emigrated from Leiden to the Massachusetts Bay Colony on the second voyage of the Mayflower. And there, in the very same Peterskirk in the shadow of which the Pilgrims lived, he said, "It is here in Leiden that the Pilgrims came to escape persecution, to live, work, and worship in peace. In the shadow of the Peterskirk, they found the freedom to witness God freely and without fear. And it is from this place that they set their course to the New World. In their search for liberty, they took with them lessons learned here of freedom and tolerance." So when you understand how important that connection is between Leiden and the Netherlands and the history of the United States, then you see that in order to really understand history, you have to have a good understanding of geography. Or, in other words, a good historian needs a great globe. This is that same globe you remember from your childhood, except it's got a sleek new design. There's white swirls and red lines to represent ocean currents. The land masses are represented in greens and browns, and every desert, every mountain range is clearly delineated. It is that level of detail, as well as these brilliant colors, that makes this MOVA globe as attractive as it is informative. If you're a fan of the History Guy, you've seen my collection of these amazing globes grow. I love the things. And yes, this is spinning all by itself. There's no wires. There's no batteries. It is spinning merely by the power of the Earth's own magnetic field and the light in this room. These are called MOVA globes, and their first-of-their-kind technology allows them to rotate just using the energy of ambient light. and they come in more than 40 designs, from world maps like this to an outer space collection to great works of art and even more. The outer space collection includes planets, it includes moons, it includes asteroid fields and constellations. And that's based on graphics that come from NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. You can check out the whole collection at movaglobes.com. I love these things. If you put one of these on your desk or up on your bookshelf, it is guaranteed to be a point of conversation, and they make great gifts. And fans of the History Guy can take advantage of special discounts. Check out the link in the description for details. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.